Welcome in to the Husker247 Podcast. I'm Michael Bruntz. Brian Christopherson's over there as we get ready to flip the page to conference play. We're already a quarter of the way through the regular season somehow, and lots to discuss today as Nebraska prepares it for Illinois on a short week. Brian, first off, how you doing? What's going on? You got look at your posture. You're sitting up straight. You're like a fan of a 2-0 team right now.
Yeah. Vikes are playing well. Sam Darnold on his way to MVP, so that's going better than expected. Minnesota Twins are cooked. It feels like they're still hanging on to a last wild card spot, but that's not going to last. So that's my rundown of my pro teams. But I'm okay. The Vikings have buoyed my spirits probably more than your Broncos have.
Yeah, look at you. It just got good quarterback play and just the world's your oyster. Let's just get into this. Nebraska took care of Northern Iowa in kind of how you expected they would. Some leaky yards, a little concern there, but I guess I don't know that we have a name for the segment yet, but do you have some thoughts left over, some stray thoughts from that game and kind of the way things played out? Specifically, I mean, did the defense and the way that game kind of unfolded, did it worry you at all? I sensed some hand wringing from the fan base just because it was a different kind of offensive game plan Nebraska had to be ready for.
Yeah, I'm not going to act like we can't take the defense to task sometimes, but it didn't really worry me. It was I think a little bit of a frustrating game for them because you got to give Northern Iowa credit too. Those dudes were like fighting their butts off for like 2 extra yards, like on every carry. And I think Rule said they had 180 yards after contact, which in the first 2 weeks, those games, it had been like in the 80s. So they can't have that against Illinois for sure, but I wasn't alarmed by it. I thought the first drive Northern Iowa had made it sort of a little bit of a game discombobulated with its rhythm. However, you got to give Nebraska's offense credit that they didn't make that become a thing. You know what I mean? Like when Northern Iowa had that big drive, 16 plays, took 10 minutes. I mean, that's 6 of the game was chewed up on that UNI drive. And Nebraska goes right back down at 7 plays, scores, makes it 14-3. And you're kind of like, oh, they're going to be fine. So Rule would say, he just wants to have control of games. He felt his team had control. And I think it's just one of those games in September where it's not all perfect, but it's almost like forgotten a lot of parts of it by, Tuesday, like when we're doing this. So I won't talk too long about it because I think a lot of people are kind of like, yeah, they handled their business. It is what it is. Friday's the big show. Let's get this going and see if they can, ratchet it up and win another game where I think the crowd will be electric.
Yeah. We can turn the page to Illinois and just say I have one more for you. It seemed like Nebraska was trying to, Matt Rule said this, that they were trying to kind of do some work on some passing stuff. And, they put more on tape than I was kind of expecting that they might against a team like Northern Iowa. But do you think Carter Nelson is a thing sooner than later?
Yeah. I think he's a thing where like every game he could pop up for, he's not gonna have like 8 catches or anything, but he could have like 2 and they could be pretty meaningful, like a third down chain mover or a touchdown like he had. I think he'll have an imprint on this season. It'll be an interesting, like kind of fun storyline, but who has the bigger one, him or Ja'Cory Barney? I would probably guess Barney at this point, but when Carter Nelson got that ball in space, a lot of guys, I guess, would have scored there, but still just watching him move for his size, it's really impressive. And you're just like, man, I would not want to tackle that. And, it was a good deal for him to get that first TD out of the way. Same for Ja'Cory. I think that's meaningful to just have that experience. Okay. You've had that storyline. You've had that moment with your family. Now you go on and you play ball. So I think that was a good thing. And I like the stuff with Harburg that they showed. As Rule said, if you make the opposition spend 20 minutes thinking about a particular set you showed them, that's worthwhile to you, even if it didn't necessarily work in that game. So I do think there was a lot of that going on. There was some a different level of chess being played where it wasn't all about Northern Iowa. It was thinking about what can we put on film that on Sunday morning Illinois is looking at, or Rutgers or Indiana.
Yeah, and especially on a short week too. I mean, if you're having to spend a half hour on what Heinrich Haarberg's going to do as a wide receiver, you probably consider that a win if you're Nebraska's coaching staff.
Yeah, and that was a fun part of the game too. I think there was that moment where Haarberg had like 3 plays in a row, and you heard the crowd, and it was almost as loud as it got all game. Just the appreciation for a guy who's stuck with it, who's a team player, a Nebraska kid. I think it meant something to Heinrich. That was a nice moment. You know, Brody Tagaloa, as I know you were following that story, getting on the field after his automobile accident prior to the 23 season is a really nice story. And, a cool quote from Brody's dad that he told Brody and Coach Matt Rule while they were in his office was, you got to embrace the delay sometimes in life. And Brody worked hard to just get on the field. So sometimes there's those things going on. I said it's a game you forget, but you always got to remember there are those things that happen for specific guys that they've been grinding at for like a year or so. And I don't want to lose track of those things.
Yeah, no, it was interesting watching Tagaloa kind of warm up because I think he'd had shoulder issues prior to, or shoulder or an elbow issue prior to the car accident. And he's warming up and he's got the big elbow brace on. He's got a big leg brace on. I mean, he was basically like half metal, holding them together. But that was pretty cool that he got out there. And another player that potentially makes it a little bit easier depth-wise to redshirt Riley Van Poppel if you have to, just because you have options there. So we can get into that too in a minute. But anything else on Northern Iowa that we didn't touch on? I mean, I agree with you, where it's kind of like one of those games where a bunch of guys get in, you feel good about it, and you move on to the next one.
Well, I think I can look back at one thing and also spring it forward to what's about to happen with Jamari Butler did not play. Mekhi Bear was out the first half because of the suspension. I think they missed Bear a little in that first half. It wasn't like you felt like alarm bells going off, like Nebraska was in trouble or anything, but he's just got so much juice to him. You saw it in the Colorado game and even the days leading up to it, that I do think he brings a different element to the defense when he's out there. And so you didn't have that on that first possession, of course. And Jamari is good to go this week. That's worth noting because he had a great game, like one of the best games of his career at Illinois last year, where he had a sack and a half and honestly could have had more. So he's definitely a guy to highlight. And then Micah Mazuka on the O-line, not being out there. They haven't gotten completely into why that is, but as Rule said, he's working through some things. He's not going to play Friday, so it's a big role for Henry Latofsky. So there's a few things from that game of guys who weren't out there and what their status is, carrying forward that are obviously of great meaning.
Yeah, I think we're all kind of working through some things at various points too. Coming into this game, what do you? How do you kind of size this up in your head? Because you had Nebraska open in very, very early lines as a 10-point favorite. I think it's down to like 8 or 8.5 somewhere. Matt Rule's expecting 4 quarters of just absolute murder ball. And, you kind of look at the numbers. I mean, nothing really jumps off the page about Illinois. Their turnover margin's really nice. One of the tops in the country. They've taken the ball away a fair amount, but how do you kind of size up this matchup, especially given that I think it's a natural tendency to look back at what happened last year and the way Nebraska kind of dominated that game. But I mean, it feels like Illinois has a few more guys this year, especially on offense, that at least can trouble you than what they had a year ago.
Yeah, I think so. They got a couple dangerous receivers in Pat Bryant and Zachary Franklin. Both have 15 and 16 catches respectively. So you gotta honor them. Tommy Hill is going to have a good game. Teams aren't even really wanting to test him. So that'll be a sidebar if Illinois even tries to go at him. I think Marquise Buford has held up pretty well at that other corner spot for the most part. He had the nice play on the third down on Northern Iowa's first drive. That was good to see, where he knocked it away. So that'll be part of it. Altmaier can run a little bit. So you have to be aware of that for a defense that I do think has struggled a little bit against the mobile quarterback. And on the other side of the ball, Illinois' defense, they lost some key dudes, but that secondary is pretty good, and they disguise their coverage as well. And Rule really emphasized this. It's going to be a test for young Dylan to examine quickly and figure out sort of their man zone disguises and what's what against a defense that has 9 takeaways, which is 5th most in the country. It's just one off being the leader. So Illinois has thrived, and they beat Kansas this way by taking the ball away. And some of it is great plays on the defensive side, but they've also tricked some quarterbacks into some mistakes. And Dylan's been great so far about not putting the ball in harm's way, but this will be, I think, a different level of chess that he'll have to navigate in this game.
What's your sense of kind of Nebraska's been able to run the ball, fine, I guess, over the first 3 games. This feels like kind of Matt Rule kind of hinted at this, I guess, or talked about it yesterday, but you're going to get a much better sense of Nebraska's offensive line from this game, I think, than anything that we've seen to this point. I mean, obviously, UTEP and Northern Iowa being what they are, but I thought they held up fine against Colorado. I don't know how good Colorado's defensive line is, but it feels like this game to me, a lot of it for Nebraska is whether or not they're able to move the ball on the ground, stay in third and manageable, second and manageable, so that you have a little bit more of an easy go with Illinois disguising coverages. You're not having to put the ball in a bad spot. I mean, I'm eager to kind of see how this Nebraska offensive line looks now against what I think is probably the best defensive line they've played to this point.
Yeah, I liked his answer there. He was kind of asked about giving an overview, and the great thing about Rule press conferences is, he can just take a topic and spin it where he wants to very quickly. And he wanted to get home that point, which I'm sure is all over. It'll be on the next Chasing 3 document. I have no doubt. Like, you're 0-0. Like, that was the preseason. That's easy to say now. Like, if you had lost one of the first 3, or you lost to Colorado, it's like it would have caused some ruckus around here.
A little ruckus.
But you didn't, and so it's wise to probably point it the way they are, as far as, okay, new season now. This is when it begins. Let's see what you're really made of, and challenge your O-line in that way. They've played good. They've given up 1 sack. Some of that you got to credit Dylan too for being able to avoid like some free man rushers and stuff like that. However, I'm with you, Bruntz. This is a game where can Nebraska, I think there's going to be that drive you have to have like in the third quarter where maybe you take 10 or 11 plays and it's not all Raiola. Maybe he does convert a 3rd and 5 throw for you, but you get some nice runs and you show that you can have that type of possession in a game like this against a physical team like that. And so that's a big moment for this O-line. I think they've made progress, but I don't think any of us are ready to put where the D-line is. And so this is the kind of game where you start to like stamp like, no, we're that type of group in the trenches too, and make that point to people.
Does Mazuka not playing concern you in a game like this?
A little bit. I think he's like a possible NFL player, like with his size and skill set and how much he's played college ball. So I don't think you just brush over it. I mean, the advantage of this situation is Latovsky started 4 games last year. So he's been around, he's played his share of snaps. And I do remember like in the spring, there was a lot of talk like from Rule, like Latovsky's a guy who expects to start now. Like he's in that mode. And so this is not like, you're taking some guy who was like the 9th guy in your room and he's suddenly in there. Like, this is a guy who they've thought all along could be in this position. So that makes it a little easier to stomach. There's no excuses. You've got a group of 5 that have played a lot of football, Latovsky included, enough so that take the challenge and, excel at it. I don't know. I need to ask you some questions. I don't want to be the only one under the heat lamp here.
Sorry, I'll put the cigarette out for a minute here. The thing I'm curious about, just to kind of dovetail off that, it seemed like for the Colorado game, Nebraska had kind of had a little bit of a separation in what they were trying to do running back wise in that rotation, where it was like Dowdell, Ramir Johnson, a little bit of Emmett Johnson, but he's kind of, basically how the depth chart has the elimination of the or now. Last game against Northern Iowa, it was kind of back to a little bit more of the balance. Nebraska only ran 48 plays in that game, so it's kind of hard to get a read on that overall. But I do wonder if this is the kind of game where they go back to what they did against Colorado, where it's more Dowdell, a little bit more downhill, kind of let him get into the flow of the game a little bit more without being so democratic about the way that they're spreading the ball around. So I'm eager to see what that picture looks like, because I think what we saw was a little bit more of, you're playing Northern Iowa versus, if there's going to be some kind of trend back to, using 3 or 4 guys. Like it feels like this feels like a Dante Dowdell kind of game to me.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's gotten down to 3 backs, it feels like.
Yeah.
Gabe hasn't been as much in the equation. Dowdell had if you go back real quick to that first game, because I think it also matters going forward, or the last game. In the first possession, Nebraska had a couple plays that weren't blocked great. And you got to give UNI credit. They're all fired up to play in Memorial Stadium and stuff like that. But Dowdell had 3 runs early on where it was really impressive, where he got 4 or 5 yards, where one could have been a loss and the other should have been 1 or 2 yards. And I think he's done really well at that. And so that's not lost on me. I do think sometimes people are like, well, Emmett Johnson's the best running back because he ripped it off. And I think there's a good argument. But Dowdell is definitely a guy who has been getting some extra yards that don't show up on highlights. And that could matter a lot in a game like this if he can do that again. So it's a good test for him too, Okay, it's Big Ten play. Let's see what you're made of against these guys. Can you do that against this type of competition?
Yeah. And I'm at the point in this season too where I would be okay with more Emmett Johnson. If he ate a little bit into whatever you're going to get from Dowdell and Ramir Johnson, I would be okay with that. I mean, I think, they've kind of talked about him as the closer and there's a place for that. I think there's also a place for him to be in there a little bit earlier. I think very rarely have I seen Emmett Johnson play and thought, yeah, I don't know about this. I don't know how this looks. If you can find 7 or 8 good carries for him a game, I would be fine with seeing that, because I think he's got good vision. I think especially in a very small workload, he's able to kind of empty the tank more so on those 7 or 8 versus, having to be in there for 20 or 25 carries. So I would be okay with a 3-man rotation right now, just based on how things go. And maybe we see a little bit more of that, but I think there's more there for Emmett to do in that rotation, especially as you get into Big Ten play.
Yeah, and it was sort of the year anniversary of when we're like, okay, we can see what you can do a little with Emmett. He had a fumble against Illinois last year, I remember, but he also had a couple of runs. It was a clunky second half, of course, but you're like, okay, he can see it a little bit. And of all the backs, Rule talked in the offseason about, okay, we want to find that guy who takes 4-yard gains and makes them 12 or 12 and 80. Emmett showed the best capability of that, you'd have to say, dating back even to last season, where he does get an explosive once a game if you give him a decent amount of carries, it feels like. So I'm kind of with you. I wouldn't mind seeing 7 or 8 from him. knowing that Dell maybe is that guy who's your hammer early on, but mixing Emmett in maybe in the second quarter more as opposed to the fourth. But that'll be, something to watch because I do think Emmett Johnson played well this past week.
What do you, I guess, with Nebraska defensively, what are kind of, is it basically about the front four doing what they can do against Illinois? The one thing that scares you a little bit, like you said earlier, I think Altmaier is pretty slippery, can get out of the pocket. And I thought Northern Iowa did a pretty good job of taking advantage of Nebraska's aggressiveness up front, because it seemed like there were a lot of times where Nebraska was getting into the backfield so quickly, but the back had snuck out or the quarterback had kind of gotten out of the pocket. And I thought they did a better job against Colorado of kind of keeping everything, in the paint, as Cam Lenhart said. Is that kind of the biggest key for you in this one, is whether or not Nebraska's front four can win against what's a better offensive line that they're going to face?
Yeah, probably. And you nailed it. It's the containment aspect. Like those first two games, you just felt like there was nowhere for that QB to go. It was like an enclosing circle around him, from all 4 points with the 4-man pass rush. So I think you and I probably threw a few quirks at Nebraska that they didn't necessarily expect. It wasn't just like they came in here and like, we're just going to run it. They came out throwing it and spread the field a little bit. And there was some stuff maybe that was a little bit of a curveball. So Illinois is going to have their curveballs too. However, if you can trust your corners to cover Brian and Franklin on the outside, that's going to also open up doors to be exotic at times and take some chances here and there. But more or less, it comes down to can that 4-man rush, which has been talked about all off season, dominated the first 2 weeks, can it be in play on Friday night? And if it is, and it feels like they can't block Ty Robinson or Nash Hutmaker from the first or second series, Husker fans will be like, all right, they're back. The black shirts, whatever was last week was whatever, but this is the group that's going to be there most games for you.
Was there anything in non-conference play that like really surprised you, that you're still like 3 weeks into it, like, wow, like I can't believe Nebraska is blank?
I think sometimes you have to step back with appreciation for the fact that Dylan Raiola only has one turnover, and it was on a pass that could have been a 50-yard completion just as easily.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you could say, oh, I kind of expected that from what I'd read, but this is a true freshman we're talking about who's played 3 games. Like, you don't necessarily just count that. You wouldn't write that down in pen, and he's done it. And last year they turned it over 31 times. So far, they've only given it away 2. So everyone's knocking on their table now that's a Husker fan, because you got to keep that going. But it just hasn't felt like he's put the ball in harm's way that much. The one where he did was Colorado, where Ramir got a touchdown. Like, that was one throw where I thought, like, oh, that could have been picked. But other than that, maybe there's been 1 or 2 other ones. And I didn't even mind the one to Jalen. I know he thought he could have put a little more air under it, but his receiver was in a position to make a big play. You trust your receivers on those, and it's 50 yards downfield. It was a pretty good throw, really. So just the command that Dylan has had from the mental side of it, I think that's not a surprise, but it's worth putting a bookmark on right now at this point. Just like we knew he had the arm talent, and I'm not surprised on an occasional 3rd and 10 he can scramble, but just his ability to dissect the defense and already kind of play the cat and mouse game against the opposition has really impressed me. I'll leave it open for you. How about something else? Like, is there a surprise to you?
I think I always get a little bit skeptical of off-season talk about skill position players and like the conversation around depth and, how many guys you've got and that kind of thing. I mean, we always talk about like, if you say you got 10 at wide receiver, it's probably closer to about 6 or 7 when it's actually time to go in and get a score. And I've been impressed with the number of guys that I think are actually contributing. I would not have expected that we would have seen Jalen Lloyd as little as we have this year, just based on the fact that he's, behind, he's number 2 on the depth chart, but they've really kind of rolled with Banks and Nair and Bonner for the most part. And, kind of mixed in Barney, I guess now Carter Nelson. Malachi Coleman is likely headed towards a red shirt. He's number 3 on the depth chart and started how many games last year? I mean, he played in 10.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's more for them to unlock at the tight end position. I think I've been impressed with the steadiness of the running backs to this point. Like, it feels like the things that Nebraska has, really tried to build up. The wide receiver depth was a big one. They've really coached the hell out of trying to eliminate turnovers and fumbles at the running back spot. I'm knocking on wood as I'm saying this, but that has been minimized so far. And I think that's been the thing where it's like at Nebraska in recent years, you have not been used to seeing things that need to be fixed. Like, you know what I mean? Like you kind of like over year to year, there were almost kind of the same issues. And it seems like early on, some of those things that were issues last year have been minimized or at least trending in the right direction. And I that shouldn't surprise me, but it kind of does just based on kind of what we've been used to over the last 7-8 years.
Yeah. I think like Dante Dowdell too, like emerging as a starter is different from what we've experienced too, where like for so long it's been like in the spring you could kind of write out like, okay, these are the returners and it's going to just sit in this nice order like it was the previous year. Maybe that's shifting a bit where you're starting to get that competition where someone goes and takes a job away from somebody else that's a good player. Like there's some good players right now on defense who aren't playing a ton right now because they're pretty loaded up over there. And so that's a nice thing to see. Now we'll see if this continues too, Bruntz, but Rule talks about controlling the game. And even though sometimes Nebraska fans love their style points, I think, like those 56-3 wins from the old days and stuff like that, I sense his teams could, even if they're really good, could have that sort of like 34-14 kind of win where you just grind, you had complete control, your hand on the game. Maybe the score doesn't crawl across the screen quite as well as it did in the olden days, but you felt like you owned it where you needed to own it. And I'll use an example of a team who did this really well when they were rising, and we don't have to get into Michigan's off the field hijinks. But when Michigan was coming up to be a championship team, remember that game a couple of years ago, Bruntz in Ann Arbor, when Nebraska played out there? And it was just like a horrible, like it was 34-3 or something. Michigan could have named the score in that game, but there was like a drive at the end of the first half where Harbaugh's taking his time and they kind of didn't use the clock. You're like, what are they doing? But they didn't really worry about it because it's like we have control of the game.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying you don't need to execute in certain spots, but if you want to really drink Kool-Aid and be hopeful, you're hoping Nebraska is kind of building that type of machine where it's just like, even if it's not always like the flashiest score, you just kind of have a dominance that the other team feels throughout. And this Friday would be a good test to see if that can happen again in a Big Ten kind of game.
Yeah, I mean it's a solid but somewhat boring recipe, right? Like good defense. I mean, special teams are, they are what they are, but you don't turn the ball over. You've got a good defense. You've got an offense that can get explosive if they need to, can run the ball a little bit too. Like, I don't know, like it feels like there's potential to, I think you're right, to be that kind of team where at the end of the game, where you're going to own time of possession, you're going to be really close in turnover margin and not have beaten yourself. I mean, I think that's what Nebraska's trying to get to. And that doesn't necessarily equal aesthetically pleasing football all the time, or would not suggest like the killer instinct that like a big touchdown pass late in the game would have. But I think Nebraska has the ingredients to be that kind of team if things keep trending the way that they are. Not saying a championship team, but just a team that can be, just can really just kind of dominate for 4 quarters, and at the end of it, you're kind of like, oh wow, that happened, I guess. Like,
Mhm. Like a well put together Big Ten team. Like we
yeah,
haven't seen Nebraska in this league really have that type of team where it's like you're matching up and okay, this is the style of football around here. Okay, we can do that and now do it better in the trenches and just wear on you, and the turnovers will be about even. We'll play that 4-quarter game, and by the end we'll be 13 to 20 points better than you. Like I haven't felt like Nebraska's had necessarily that Big Ten team, and I kind of feel like maybe that's what they're building. But now we see, like, I mean, we could be singing a different tune after Friday night's game. They got to go out and just keep doing it and have that drum beat of consistency now.
anything else? We're up against the time here.
Not from me. I mean, I think Friday night's going to be another one where the crowd's on one, so it's going to be that'll be fun, I think.
Yeah. It's Nebraska, Illinois on Friday night under the lights. We'll have full coverage leading up to that game, during the game, after the game at Husker247. Be sure to get there for all of your Nebraska coverage. We'll see what kind of tune we're singing this weekend after that one, but another big one, a ranked matchup. First one in Memorial Stadium since UCLA.
Is that what it is?
I think so. I believe the last time Nebraska played a ranked team when they were ranked was that was the Tommy Armstrong Ohio State game, which we'll leave that where it was.
And the other one in Memorial Stadium was Nebraska UCLA 2013.
I believe so.
Okay.
Where both teams were ranked.
Yeah.
I believe that's true.
Black jerseys.
Yeah.
Interesting week that followed, but anyway.
All Avery Moss had to do was get Hundley on the ground, and it probably turns out a lot differently. All right. So, anyways, Husker247, get it locked there. We'll have plenty of content coming, Hypecast coming later this week as well to get you ready for Friday's game. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you later.